Yesterday, the United States carried out a series of airstrikes across the Middle East, targeting Iranian-backed militias in response to a drone strike that killed 3 American soldiers last week. We'll talk about what we know so far, what this means going forward, decipher some of the information that's coming out to make it a little easier to understand, as well as the international reaction so far to this wave of attacks. So let's get into it. I'm recording this at 8 a.m. Central on Saturday, February 3rd, 2024. Before getting into the details of the strike, I want to just remind everyone the reason that this is taking place, the catalyst for this wave of attacks, was that 3 American soldiers were killed in Jordan last week. The names of the fallen, they've all been posthumously promoted. Staff Sergeant William Rivers, Sergeant Kennedy Sanders, and Sergeant Brianna Moffitt. So the information that we have as of this point is that over the course of 30 minutes, U.S. Central Command carried out strikes against 85 targets using 125 precision munitions in 7 locations. 4 of those were in Syria, and 3 of these were in Iraq. The United States at this point says that the strikes appear to be successful, but I haven't seen anything in terms of a publicly released battle damage assessment. In a statement from President Biden, he said, quote, "The United States does not seek conflict in the Middle East or elsewhere in this world, but let those who might seek to do us harm know this. If you harm an American, we will respond." So getting into some of the details that we know at this point, the United States says that they were able to strike facilities that included command and control operation centers, intelligence centers, rockets and missiles and unmanned aerial vehicle storage, logistics and munition supply chain facilities of militia groups and their IRGC sponsors who facilitated attacks against U.S. and coalition forces. IRGC is the Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Quds Force is the element of that organization that trains, equips, and kind of finances and supports a lot of these militias across the region. Again, what we've seen over the course, really since mid-October, is north of 160 attacks carried out against U.S. forces by these Iranian-backed militias in the region. And the most recent of which, there have been a few since, but the most significant recently, I should say, is the drone strike in Jordan last weekend that killed 3 American service members. In a statement from the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, he said, "This is the start of our response. The president has directed additional actions to hold the IRGC and affiliated militias accountable for their attacks on U.S. and coalition forces. These will unfold at times and places of our choosing. We do not seek conflict in the Middle East or elsewhere, but the president and I will not tolerate attacks on American forces. We will take all necessary actions to defend the United States, our forces, and our interests." There were some rumors last week in the lead up to this strike campaign that it would be that it would be a campaign, that it wouldn't be one-off. What we've seen to this point, this most recent wave of violence across the Middle East, really since the October 7th Hamas attack in Israel, when we're looking at the attacks against American forces, it's been the occasional drone, rocket, or missile attack against U.S. forces, sometimes multiple a day against locations in Iraq and Syria. And then at times, the U.S. has responded. I want to say prior to this, it was roughly 10 strikes that the U.S. had carried out against the 160 strikes carried out by these Iranian-backed militias. So the big thing that changed here was the loss of life of 3 American soldiers. And the idea, what it looks like that the U.S. is trying to get at here, is some sort of deterrence going forward. The one-for-one isn't working, so the scope of this campaign and the fact that it's not just one day of strikes, or in this case, 30 minutes of strikes, but likely to continue, and Secretary of Defense saying, this is just phase 1. There's more coming. The idea here is deterrence. Make this so painful for Iran and their militias across the region that the next time they think about striking a U.S. base, be it with a drone, missile, or even a little unguided rocket, they think twice about it and say it's not worth it. You remember what happened last time? So we're looking at the significance of the strikes that took place yesterday. I believe, and somebody please fact check me on this, I believe this is the largest single strike against these Iranian-backed militias since at least the phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom, which ended back in 2011. So at least in the last 13 years, this is the largest wave of concurrent strikes against these militia groups. There may have been some of this scope carried out during the counter-ISIS campaign in Iraq and Syria, but 85 targets in 30 minutes is a substantial campaign to kick off. I'm not even sure we would have been doing that kind of in the peak of the counter-ISIS campaign. While those strikes were just continuous, 85 in the course of 30 minutes is significant. So there's a lot of different ways to message to an adversary when you're trying to play this sort of deterrence game that I believe the United States is engaged in right now. So you could, for instance, kill leadership figures. A couple of years ago, the killing of Qasem Soleimani was one way to go about doing this. You could argue whether or not it's been effective. You could also strike in areas that the adversary thinks is not reachable, right? Maybe behind their air defenses or inside of their territory where you haven't hit before. But in this case, the way in which this attack was carried out was a message in of itself. So hitting 85 targets across 2 countries in 30 minutes after letting the whole world know that we're coming for more than a week without losing a single plane or U.S. service member, that is a significant message, right? That is a message to Iran, a reminder of the U.S. military capabilities and how quickly we can deploy very accurate and lethal forces to the Middle East. There was a lot of conversation this last week, and I made a video about it yesterday, saying there's been a surprising amount of signaling going on and telegraphing to the Iranians specifically that this attack is coming. And that could have led to a couple different things, right? On the one hand, you could look at that and say they are given the opportunity to evacuate some of these locations. They can move some of their equipment out. Yes and no. On the other hand, it also opens up the communications network and has all of these groups chattering, saying, are we going to move? Are we going to relocate that the U.S. or our allies could pick up on? And we even saw some rifts emerging within some of these Iranian-backed militias. Right, we saw Kataib Hezbollah say, actually, we're going to sit this out. We're just going to be in a defensive posture from here on out. No more attacks against American forces. And by the way, Iran doesn't even know what we do. We're all acting on our own. We conduct jihad in our own way, is what they said. Part of that was the U.S. starting to talk up, like, hey, we're coming. This strike is coming, and we're going to strike multiple targets across multiple days, weeks, and potentially even months. So what I would say, based off of what we've seen at this point, is that, again, just the scope and the way that this attack was carried out was a signal in of itself. Again, we don't yet have the details of what exactly was hit. We got a rough estimate, and we don't know the total casualty figures as of yet and who those casualties are. It also makes a big difference if the casualties are civilians, if they are Iraqis or Syrians fighting in these militias, or if they are Iranian personnel out there training these forces on behalf of Tehran. Big difference in that, still waiting to see on that front. So a little background here that I thought could be helpful in kind of understanding the numbers that we're seeing coming out of this is talking about the difference between targets, locations, and munitions. So what we've seen, the information that comes out is that 7 locations with 85 targets and 125 different munitions. So to give an example here, if one of those locations was a village in Anbar province, Iraq, so western portion of Iraq, that would be one of the 7 locations. In that location, there might be multiple targets. Let's say a barracks used by the IRGC Quds Force. You might have a command and control center operated by one of the Iranian-backed militias in the region, and then maybe a storage facility for missiles, rockets, and drones. So we'll say that one location has 3 different targets. Each one of those targets, and there's people in the U.S. military where this is their job, this is what they focus on for these strike campaigns, is to figure out what type of munition and how many of those munitions are needed to achieve the desired effects. So the command and control center might require 2 500-pound bombs. The weapon storage facility might require 3 1,000-pound bombs, and the barracks might require 1 1,000-pound bomb, for instance. So what you're seeing is that's where the difference comes in here. Not every target gets the same number of munitions. It could be vastly different. Say one of these was a rocket launch site, for instance, right? It's a single truck with a able to launch drones off the back. That's identified as one of the targets in this Anbar province location. 1 bomb should do the trick there, no issues, right? But to bring down a warehouse full of munitions, it's going to require more. So that's where you see the difference between targets, munitions, and locations. Hopefully that's helps clear that up a little bit. Now, I did see some speculation yesterday talking about how much of the Iranian capability in Iraq and Syria has been destroyed, or that it's all gone. It hasn't. The only thing I know for sure at this point is that the Iranian military capability through these proxy forces has not been eliminated in Iraq and Syria. It's the same thing we saw with the Houthis down in Yemen. We do not have the capability for one wave of strikes, or even 2, 3, 4 waves of strikes, to completely eliminate the offensive capability. The number of drones, rockets, missiles, mortars, and militia locations, quite frankly, across these two countries is way more than we're going to be able to strike in any given air campaign. So what I would expect to see based off of the information we have so far is a degradation in the ability of some of these militia groups. They might be hampered in the very short term to carry out operations, but in terms of, none of these groups are going to be out of drones. None of them are going to be out of missiles or rockets, and they still will have the capability to adjust their chain of command as needed if they lost leadership figures and continue this fight going forward. They are used to this in a lot of ways. So again, think of this as a hiccup, a degradation, but not a complete elimination of this threat across the region. So then turning to information that we're getting from external sources, kind of the response so far to the strike, I want to say first that I haven't seen any public announcements from any of these jihadi groups, any Iranian-backed militias, Kataib Hezbollah, Hamas, none of these organizations, the Houthis, or any of the ones in Iraq and Syria have spoken to casualties. Traditionally, they do. In past strikes, when it's carried out by the United States, by Israel, or anyone else in Iraq and Syria, you will see each one of these groups, or at least a couple of these groups, kind of share those casualties, praising the sacrifice of their fellow organizations. None of that has come out yet, so we're still waiting for that. What we do have are some announcements from Syrian state media and Iraqi media. So the Syrian state media said, quote, U.S. occupation forces launched on Saturday a blatant aerial aggression on a number of sites and towns in the eastern region of Syria near Iraqi borders, leaving many civilian and military martyrs, injuring others, and causing huge damage to private and public properties. They said the U.S. aggression today has no justification, but is an attempt to weaken the Syrian army's capability to fight terrorism. And what they cited was that the Syrian military capability, with some of these militia groups, is in that region fighting back against Islamic State. So the way that Syria is framing this is the United States facilitating Islamic State to continue their fight in Syria, for reference, because I think we're probably going to get a lot more of that. And then Iraqi media came out and said that at least 16 people had been killed in U.S. strikes in Iraq, and they condemned the new aggression against its sovereignty. They said civilians were among those killed, and 25 people were wounded in the bombings that targeted both civilian and security areas. And they quoted Al Jazeera as saying the Quds Force had no bases in the region struck, which is, we'll see. The Quds Force, again, it's when you're looking at some of these organizations like the Quds Force, you're not looking for a flag in the ground. You're not going to be able to see a clear military facility from overhead imagery. This is a shadowy type organization, deliberately so. That's how they've been set up. And a lot of times they're not in a 100% clearly marked military facility, right? They're blending in as best they can with the civilian population, the Quds Force, as well as some of these militia forces. So I'd be a little skeptical of any claim right now that no Quds Force bases were struck at all. Again, waiting on that confirmation. The Iranian media that I've seen so far come out has really just been mirroring what's coming out of Syria and Iraq. Nothing additional from Iran at this point. In fact, a couple of the statements I saw from the Iranian state media was just a roll-up, was just quoting like the Department of Defense, CENTCOM, and the Associated Press. So not really any analysis on their end at this point, no major opinion. Seems like we're still waiting for kind of the official Iranian statement about what took place. But that, hopefully, a little overview of what we've got so far. There's a lot of rumors still circulating. I'll do my best in the coming days to try to sift through those and provide the best information of what we have available at this point. But that's all I've got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, we're continuing to cover a lot of different arenas of warfare and conflict around the world on Substack. The link is in the description below. We've recently brought some people on board, some authors, analysts, researchers, really bright people, and they're putting together really interesting pieces about a whole range of topics that I think are complementary to what we're talking about in these videos here. They're all free. I think it'll be a pretty valuable resource. So, of course, be sure to check that out below if interested. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.